Hello everybody. Welcome to Psych Motivation. We're going to talk some personality characteristics today. I love discussing personality. I know I'm a social psychologist and I'm all about the situation. But personality is the other side of the coin. So when we want to explain behavior, it's, hey, was it because of the situation that I observed the behavior? Is it because of the person's personality, their traits that I observed the behavior? Or, hey, let's talk Lewinian here. Let's give props to Kurt Lewin. What did Kurt Lewin say behavior was? He said it's a function of the person in the environment. So personality and situation. So let us then begin. Nice little you like this picture? You can see the back end of Boots here. This is after Boots had come into the house. I brought Boots into the house. I said, you look pregnant. And she was pregnant all right, but man, she wasn't all that pregnant when I brought her in. It was quite a while before she had her kittens, and she had 6 of these very plump, robust kittens, all getting ready to move to their life on the farm. Yeah, one of my colleagues at Columbus State adopted all 6 of them to her farm. So Boots remains. The kittens are gone. Boots been spayed. As Dr. Queller, our vet, says, another retired mother, right? So once we get them spayed, he views that as their retirement. Let's talk state versus trait. All right? I'm going to explore both state and trait motivated behaviors and attitudes in this module. Now, state is the power of the situation. Trait brings us back to personality. So when we try to explain behavior, many people go state versus trait. As I suggested, Kurt Lewin would say it's some combination of both. So let's see how they interact, right? Traits, though, exist over the long haul, are largely thought to solidify during adolescence, and they may reflect genetic dispositions. I'm an extrovert, and the research shows that, hey, probably 50% of my extroversion is attributable to my genetic makeup, right? So some traits have a very strong genetic component. Others not as much, right? States are typically responses to the environment, temporarily activated attitudes and behaviors. Now, one of the first places that people began to look at this in the laboratory was trait versus state self-esteem. One thing we found is we could measure self-esteem with the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, and we could make predictions about how people might behave on the basis of their self-esteem to various laboratory manipulations. But what became more interesting in a laboratory paradigm is that we found we could actually manipulate people's state self-esteem. That is, temporarily push their self-esteem up, temporarily push their self-esteem down, and then we could see the effect that would have on the experimental manipulation. Right? So both state and trait, undeniably and equally important. So interesting, the behaviors and attitudes are what they are for the most part, regardless of the source. So when we observe a behavior, the behavior is what the behavior is. If we see someone demonstrating an attitude, the attitude is what it is. Whether it was derived from state or trait or some combination of both, the behavior is the behavior, right? So individual differences then, let's take some examples here. In happiness, arousal, and control. Why do different people have different motivational and emotional states even in the same situation? Okay, that sounds like an interesting question, right? Some examples follow. So what do we see? Well, happiness, we see that extroversion has some correlation with happiness. I mean, it's not 100% correlation, so, take that arrow for what it is, right? And then people who score high in neuroticism then might, in fact, demonstrate greater levels of unhappiness. But the interesting thing here is extroversion and neuroticism are not 2 points on the same continuum. They're points on different continuums, if you will. But let's take a look at extroversion and happiness. Well, we see then extroverts, greater capacity than introverts to experience positive emotions, stronger and more sensitive to positive stimuli in the environment. And they have a more robust behavioral activation system. What is the behavioral activation system, Annika? You don't want to answer that question. You say, they're paying me the big bucks, I should frickin' answer it, huh? Okay, so I will. behavioral activation system is moving towards elements that seem to be appealing in the environment, right? So, eagerness to approach potentially rewarding situations. So an extrovert is out there, they're monitoring their environment, they're looking around and they say, oh, that's potentially cool. Oh, that's potentially cool. Oh, that's potentially cool. And they're more likely than to operate on that, to go seek the reward that's afforded by these situational components, right? So greater sociability, because extroverts also learn, I mean, they may be genetic extroverts, but they learn over time that, wow, a lot of good things can come through interaction, opportunities, etc., right? Interest. Greater social dominance than introverts. They like that kind of hierarchy, if you will, and greater venturesomeness than introverts. They're more willing to strike out and go find that pot of gold that may or may not be at the end of the rainbow. Now, neuroticism, what happens with neuroticism? Well, greater capacity in emotionally stable individuals to experience negative emotions as a component of neuroticism. Stronger and more sensitive behavioral inhibition system. So while extroverts got that behavioral activation system, hey, let's go out here, introverts tend to possess a more robust behavioral inhibition system, the flip side of the coin. Hey, let's not do that. Let's inhibit these behaviors, right? And they demonstrate then greater eagerness to avoid potentially punishing situations. So their sensitivity with neuroticism, the sensitivity is, boy, I really need to avoid pain. Extroverts, on the other hand, what they're really doing is, I need to search out reward. It's not that one is right or wrong. It just demonstrates a preference that can probably go all the way back to genetic legacy in its beginning. So we'll see with neuroticism, greater avoidance behavior and emotional distress than emotionally stable individuals. Let's talk a little bit about arousal. Keep it brief though, right? Arousal's contribution to motivation. Well, first, a person's arousal level is mostly a function of how stimulating the environment is. And remember, we talked about affordances. And I also talked about, and you guys have done exercises, how does the environment affect me? Right? So to the extent that we engineer our own environments, that we select aspects of our environment that create greater affordances, right, that contribute to greater levels of arousal, at least positive level of arousal. Right? People engage, this is the second one, people engage in behavior to increase or decrease their level of arousal based on their current needs. Right? Pretty simple. Third, when under-aroused, people seek opportunities to increase their arousal levels because increases in environmental stimulation are pleasurable. They enhance performance, whereas decreases are aversive and undermine performance. So again, we can be kind of masters of our own fate in this regard, as we can select the environments that meet our needs. And I think overall we're going to be more satisfied to the extent that we become skilled and mindful in understanding our current arousal level, our relationship to that arousal level, where we want it to be, and what we need to do to get it there, right? So engineering our own lives, if you will. Now, when over-aroused, people seek out opportunities to decrease their arousal levels because increases in environmental stimulation are aversive. And this is very, very, very obvious in cats and feline behavior. Cat comes over. Annika wanted to be pet, right? So I pet Annika, right? And that is, she wants to attain a certain level of arousal. So she presents herself to be pet to increase her level of arousal. But how many of you know the trap of rubbing a cat's belly? Oh, cats they look so cute, and they roll over on their back and they say, please rub my furry belly. And they're like good for a little rubbing, but then when you go too far, when their arousal level goes from under-aroused to optimal arousal to over-aroused, watch out, because this is when they typically clamp on, right, and bite or scratch and hold your hand hostage there. So one thing I've learned from cats is they have different set points of arousal. Some cats appreciate more arousal. Some cats want very minimal arousal. And when you cross that threshold when a cat becomes over-aroused, or the term they typically use when talking about cats is overstimulated, then you better knock it off, because the cat's going to let you know that they've had enough, right? They may just leave, but other times, sometimes they bite or scratch, right? So, performance and emotion, well, this U-shaped curve, this inverted curve, how many of you are sick of seeing this? The Yerkes-Dodson curve in all its glory, splendor, and different variations, right? What we see here is when the arousal level is low, the arousal level high, moderate arousal level, our best performance, right, and our best state is achieved at the optimal arousal level, which is a moderate arousal level. If the arousal level is low, we'll probably show increasing alertness, positive interest, and we'll seek out something that can increase, right? So this would be the behavioral activation system is saying, hey, let's get some more arousal. But then if arousal becomes too high, then we may see emotional disturbance, anxiety, and that is we seek to reduce the arousal with the BIS. So the extroversion portion of the curve is probably on this side, and then the neurotic version of the curve on this side. If you want to put those two together, I am taking some liberty in so doing. Now, let's talk insufficient stimulation and under arousal. Sensory deprivation. And this is a sensory emotional experience in a rigidly unchanging environment. I immediately, because obviously we're in an academic context, I don't know, I've had some of those classes where, I remember one class at UCI, the teacher was a nice guy, but man, his idea was teaching is, this is back in the day when people were using overheads rather than, an overhead projector. So he's got, and what he did is he just typed out his lecture notes, right? So there's his lecture notes, the whole thing in 12-point font. And what does he do? Full page of text. He slaps that on the overhead projector and then he reads it, right? And then next, done, take that one off, put the next one on. And you walk in at the beginning of class and you just look at that stack of overheads, the acetates he's got, and it's going, oh my God, that stack is about this thick. This might be the end of me, this class session. And you just sit there, and you got to sit, right? You're in class, you got to sit to the end, and he's just going to talk in his monotone. He's going to read these overheads, and right? I mean, it's like sensory deprivation. The clock becomes amazingly fascinating because at least it changes. Right, but everything else is just right? So now Heron sensory deprivation study, let's take it a step further and cause real sensory deprivation. And this is when you put your participant into a sensory deprivation tank. And in these tanks, I mean, there's a lot of ways to get at this, but one way is to have body temperature water, right? And the person floats in this body temperature water. It's soundproofed and it's darkened. So there's no light, there is no sound, and there is no feeling of changes of atmosphere. I mean, everything is held absolutely constant. Put people in those, well, the brain nervous system prefers some kind of continual moderate level of arousal generated by the environment, by environmental stimulation, right? Participants experience hallucinations, and most quit the study within 2 to 3 days. They just couldn't take it. Now, this is also a form of torture, is solitary confinement, especially in a darkened room, over an extended period of time, right? Well, we harbor motives for counteracting insufficient stimulation and under arousal. That is, we seek out affordances so that we can increase our arousal, so to speak, right? If we're able to do so. Now, and think about how demotivating some jobs are for your employees. If it's the same thing, day in, day out, right? It becomes more and more difficult to come to work every day because it's just insanely boring. Now, in some manufacturing facilities, what they would do is rotate positions on the assembly line. So, for the first 2 hours of my shift, I'm doing this. The next 2 hours, I'm doing something else on the assembly line. The next 2 hours, I mean, even when I was at the lumber mill and we had to pull lumber which is a most mind-numbing and grueling, physically grueling task, where you're just pulling lumber off the chain and making a stack, making a unit of lumber that can be shipped to a customer, and you're pulling this off, and for this 2 hours, right, I'm going to pull anything that's 14 or 16 feet long and A grade into this pile, and anything that's 14 or 16 feet long that's B grade into the pile next to it, and that's all I do for 2 hours until break time, right? Believe me, the simple joy of moving to the next 2 stacks, if you will, combats at least a minute portion of the boredom or under arousal, right? So let's look at homework 8, part 1. Let's do A and B. Okay. To what extent does your use of media fulfill your arousal needs? So let's face it, when we're sitting at home, let's go sit on the couch. Here we are sitting on the couch. What are you doing on the couch? You're just going to sit there and stare at the wall? Most of us are going to find that uncomfortable pretty quickly. I'm going to stare at this wall. I'm just going to sit here. I'm not going to move. I'm going to stare at the wall. No, we don't do that, right? We need a certain level of arousal, and our needs vary. I mean, our baseline arousal. But what are we going to do? Well, maybe I'll put on some music, or I'll put on the TV, or I know, let's look at some TikTok videos, because there's nothing more interesting than pictures of cats, right? Okay, so question 1 then, A, and this is for everyone to answer. That's why it says everyone does, 1A, right? To what extent does your use of media fulfill your arousal needs? Continuing on this, how strong is the felt motivation over a significant period of time of deprivation? And I got a scale for you to fill out here. And then another question, right, is what is significant time of deprivation? So everyone in your team completes 1A, which is actually 3 questions, right? And then one team member is going to do 1B. How does introversion versus extroversion become satisfied via internet use? Example and explanations. And what I'm getting at here, I don't have a hypothesis on this necessarily, not a robust hypothesis, but after reading your homework, I might develop some hypotheses that can be exploited in future homework assignments. We talked about extroversion, so the flip side is introversion, right? What do you think? Is an extrovert likely to satisfy their arousal needs using internet-based media in a way that's different than introverts would? So work that out, whoever is going to answer 1B, okay? Now, 1A, here is the table that I want you to fill out. Okay, and everyone answers this. To what extent does your use of media, online, radio, TV, fulfill your arousal needs? And then you place an X, right? And notice, this, you don't have to put your name here, right? We'll keep it confidential. So, team member number 1, answer the question. To what extent, right, does your use of media, online, radio, TV, etc., fulfill your arousal needs? And put an X. If it's not at all, okay, or somewhat, or a lot, that's fine. So each team member gets a row, and just put your 1X on one of those 5 choices. Now, let's look at the second part of 1A. How strong is the felt motivation to engage in the media use after a significant period of deprivation, right? So now what I'm doing is I can't prevent myself from doing research. So even if it's just informal research, the one thing that fascinates me more than anything is, why do people behave and why do people think that the way they do? I mean, that's why I'm a psychologist, right? So now, how strong is the felt motivation to engage in media use after a significant period of deprivation? Place an X, right? Well, I haven't looked at the internet all day or social media or whatever, and I don't care. So then I might say no felt motivation. And it's like, wow. I've been in class all day long, and I need to check what's going on Facebook, right? So moderate level of felt motivation. Right? Or how about, oh my God, I cannot even get through class without checking TikTok. Or I can't get through class without, right? And that might be extremely high felt motivation to check, right? Okay. And then, finally, third part of this, notice I'm trying to get a profile. Okay. what do you consider a significant amount of time of deprivation? Because as I was working out those first two questions, I said, well, being deprived of the use of media might mean different things to different people in terms of duration. Some people might go all day and say, yeah, okay, I'm starting to feel deprived, I want to check in now. Some people, and we know who those people are, can't go 2 minutes without looking at their phone, that they have to check in, right? So that's what I want here, and again, it's anonymous, so each one of you on your team gets a separate row, the time in minutes, hours, or days, and please indicate that. So if you're like, oh my God, I haven't looked at WhatsApp for 5 minutes and it's killing me, I got to look at it, right? Then you put 5 minutes. You know, if some of you are like, oh wow, I didn't even get on Facebook yesterday, maybe I should do that today, then 1 day, right? So give me an idea, it'll allow me to understand this. And then one team member, of course, answers that final question for part 1, and that's 1B, right? A paragraph for each should suffice in talking about the introversion versus extroversion. Give me an example. Explain your reasoning behind it. Okay? All right. So let us move on then. There's more portions to this assignment, as you know. So if you're worried that, oh my God, I don't get to do it, that's all right. There'll be more opportunities for you in this assignment. So what do we know? Excessive overstimulation, overarousal. Well, overstimulating stressful environments. What are the results? Well, they can cause emotional disruption. And notice the associated emotions are anxiety, irritability, and anger. And as we return to thinking about emotions, which we discussed in the previous 2 lectures, note that these emotions have strong motivating qualities to them. If I am overstimulated or in a stressful environment causes me emotional disruption, anxiety, irritability, and anger, the motivational properties of these is to reduce the level of stimulation. Right? That's really the purpose of those emotions in this context. Now, it also causes cognitive disruption. Confusion, forgetfulness, impaired concentration are all potential aspects of overstimulating environments. So most of us want to control the environment in which we're doing homework or writing a paper, for example, to be at an optimal level of stimulation. But notice that differs. Some people need absolute quiet, need silence, right? And they should be in a soundproof room to work on an assignment. How many of you prefer to write a paper with music in the background? But then some of us, I mean, I love to do my work with music, but sometimes some music is too arousing or maybe too lyrically involved or complex that that's not the proper choice, because then it competes for my attention, right? So this is why often people will study to something like a lot of Mozart's work, because, or sometimes Bach, for various reasons. And then the physiological disruption, the sympathetic nervous system, the hyperactivity, right? This is the physical manifestation of what we're discussing here. So human beings harbor motives for counteracting excessive stimulation and overarousal. And note that the physiological disruption, how many of you work to control your breathing and or do yoga, or man, I'm too worked up, I need to go for a run, or I need to get to the gym and I need to work out. I need to work off some of this energy, right? That we've got that stimulus, that additional stimulation. And this is the beauty of exercise, because it often, this is what our body needs to do based on our environment at that given time. Now, that inverted U hypothesis that we looked at, you know, I don't know how many classes you've probably seen that in, and we talk about it as if there's no opposing view, but let's take a look. Nicest criticism, the inverted U does not apply to everyday affairs in which arousal remains, doesn't change much at all, right? So it doesn't apply to every context we might find ourselves in. And the inverted U hypothesis applies nicely to everyday sources of stimulation, but caffeine and time pressure, right? So we can see the effects of wait a second, I have to have another drink of my coffee. And notice that, in fact, if you put me under time pressure, and this is interesting today because I said, I really want to get 4 of these taped today. Right? I really want to get 4 lectures taped today. I need to kick myself in the ass. I need to get going, and my coffee intake is increased. That is, I'm actually manipulating my arousal level to get it done, so to speak. So we have ability to do this, and to make those choices to create the environmental affordances. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about sensation seeking. And note, sensation seeking, right? Like we talk in terms of people who are adrenaline junkies, for example. How many of you want to go whitewater rafting? Or bump up the game, how many of you want to go whitewater kayaking? Does that look cool or what? Or how about bungee jumping? That seems like that might be fun, right? I'm going to allow someone I don't know to strap my ankles up on equipment that I've never used before, and then I'm going to jump off this damn bridge to what could be my death, right? Let's suppose someone didn't rig it correctly, or the bands are old and they're going to snap, etc. These are all potential outcomes. And yet some people can't get enough of it, right? And these are people who are sensation seekers, right? They like to be aroused. They like that increased level of sensation. It's related to the extent to which a person's central nervous system, brain, spinal cord, require change and variability. So people with high sensation seeking levels, right, they want that greater range of experience. People who are not sensation seekers, right, they don't like going beyond that certain threshold, where sensation seekers are eager to pay big money to do so. So how do we define sensation seeking? It's varied, novel, complex, intense sensations and experience, the willingness to take physical, social, legal, financial risks for the sake of such experiences. And legal risks. I mean, when I was in high school, when I was in Van Nuys, the guys I grew up with in Van Nuys before I was moved out of Van Nuys, probably for my own good by my mom, it was an era of fast cars. You know, my buddy Paul had 2 cars, doing pretty well, and he wasn't rich by any means, but cars were his thing, and he had this beautiful El Camino, 67 El Camino, and then he had a Pontiac Le Mans, and man, both these cars are fast. And then our buddy Richard Ware had a Dodge Super Bee with the Hemi in it, and this is the original. These cars are fucking so fast. They're crazy fast, and they drove them like maniacs. High level of sensation seeking, right? And this is a great personal risk of injury, but also, you know, and then the lesser risks of citations, etc., arrest for driving like a maniac. But that's what people did. Okay? So, sensation seeking then. Sensation seekers continually search for novel experiences, something new to do that provides them additional arousal. Sensation seekers see sensations and experiences being worth physical, social, legal, or financial risks. So sensation seekers have adopted a risk-taking paradigm. And the biological basis, it probably has to do with the MAO. Sensation seekers tend to have relatively high levels of dopamine. Their biochemistry favors approach, right? And then we see people who have relatively low levels of serotonin, hence their biochemistry fails to inhibit. So serotonin is associated with the BIS we talked about, and the dopamine, the BAS, roughly speaking. Hey, Penelope. What are you doing, Penelope? You going to come up here and say hello to everybody? Come on, Penelope. Come on up here. Penelope's half suspicious of me all the time now. She's getting medicine twice a day for her sinus infection, and she hates the medicine, you know, because it's a liquid antibiotic, and you know, I put it in the syringe and squirt it in her mouth, so she's very suspicious of me. Twice a day she has to have her medicine. Penelope, come up here. And you'd think it was killing her, right? So Affect intensity, and this is interestingly something that we did in a Psych of Emotion this semester for a change, something new, that we talked about in terms of the variability in the affect. Hey, there's Penelope. How you doing, sweetie? All right. So we have relatively affect stable individuals. That is, their affect intensity doesn't vary to a great degree. And these are people who appear relatively calm and unvaried. Then there's people who go from chilled out to boom, explosive, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? So it's a measure of the intensity level. What does this mean, though? Well, what we see then is low affect intensity. These folks, right, the slightly bad event hardly affects their mood at all. A moderately bad event affects their mood to a certain degree, puts them in a moderately bad mood, and a very bad event. But notice that the high affect intensity, the person with a lot of variability, experiences the bad mood to the same stimuli to a greater degree. But there's a flip side to this, right? That is, for good events, affect intense individuals pull a lot more out of the good event than the affect, the less variable affect folks. So there's kind of two sides to the coin. That is, affective intense people, bam, bam, bam. They feel the highs and they feel the lows with a greater level of intensity than the more affect stable folks. Right? In the context of psychology of emotion, what we are actually exploring then from understanding this is, does it imply something for relationships? What is it like for a high affect intense, high variable person to partner up with a low variable person? Does it matter? Is it an important kind of domain to consider in relationships? Okay. Affect intensity. Now, control. What is one's level of perceived control? That is, differences in people's pre-performance expectancies, right? Possessing the needed capacity to produce positive outcomes. So to what extent do you believe you have control over this environment, right? To what extent do you feel that you have control over receiving medicine or not? And then the desire for control. To what extent does the individual, are they motivated to establish control over the events in their lives? So we can see that these two function together. And let's look out. In order to perceive that one has control over a given situation, the self must be capable of obtaining the available desired outcome. That is, I got to know that I can do it. Right? The situation in which one attempts to exercise control needs to be at least somewhat predictable and responsive. So these two components allow me to exert the control, but if I don't believe that I can achieve the level of performance necessary, or I believe that I can achieve the level of performance necessary, but this environment is too flaky that I'm not sure in this environment it's a go, then either one is going to represent, let's say, perhaps a loss of perceived control. So high perceived control versus low perceived control, right, is the result of our perceived control beliefs. It has an effect on myriad functions. Goal setting. If I believe that I can make something happen, that's going to affect my goal setting strategy, right? If I believe that I can make something happen in this area but not that area, then I may choose to perform in this area, do this task rather than a task that I can't, right? Effort. If I believe I can do it, I'm likely going to expend more effort, right? I'm likely to expend more concentration. If I believe ultimately I can do it, then I'm likely to persist even when obstacles present themselves, right? If I have a high level of perceived control, I enter into a task, all else being equal, in a more positive emotional state. I'm likely to engage a wider variety of problem-solving strategies and demonstrate a higher level of performance as a result of this. So we can see that perceived control has a huge number of benefits as perceived control goes up. Now, I want to tie this as we get towards the end of the course. I like to go back and tie it to things we've already talked about. Let's talk about Saul Kassin. He did his talk on mastery experiences, right? To the extent that you master a challenge, let's say an academic challenge, and you're demonstrating mastery, you're going to be rewarded with a higher level of perceived control. And it's going to make you more willing and more positive in your approach to further challenges. Those of us, though, who, let's say, got into math classes and we didn't do well, right? And we're continually challenged by math, and we feel ourselves slipping backwards in our math abilities, and then we go to take another math class, a higher level math class. We're like, no, I have no control over the outcome. I'm probably going to get a crappy grade, and there's nothing I can do about it. We're more likely to then not take that class, or as we like to kid, we're more likely to change. Yeah, I know. From a Bachelor of Science in Psychology to a Bachelor of Arts, so we don't have to take calculus. That being said. So, self-confirming aspect of personal control and engagement. We got our perceived control beliefs as high versus low. Engagement versus disaffection. So, the greater my perceived control, right, the higher that is, the more likely I'm to engage in a task. The lower my perceived control, the more likely I am to become disaffected by that task and want to disengage, and notice how this affects the actual outcomes. So let's do homework 8 part 2 then. One team member, or two can split it, you know, if you want to, it's up to you, but it is designed for one person, but I don't want to be too heavy-handed and say only one person can do it. If this appeals to two of you and you want to split it and work together, that's okay too. Describe a situation that's led to increased engagement. What were the perceived control beliefs and how did they affect your motivation level, perceived engagement, and the ultimate outcome? So it's not domain specific. It could apply to the outcome of play, work, conversation, self-improvement, just about anything. It really is your choice in the example that you pull together. Now flip it around and do the same for disaffection, that is disengagement. So we're going to then have the narratives, right? We're going to have the engagement narrative, and that's the paragraph, the robust, stout paragraph, if you will. And then the disaffection narrative is another paragraph to handle both of these. So in what situation do you believe that you have control? Give me an example and how it affects you. And then do the flip side, the disengagement, right? So, desire for control. What do we know? Well, high desire for control compared with low desire for control. What does it do to the aspiration level? Well, people with a high desire for control select harder tasks, set goals more realistically, right? They react with greater effort. They work at a difficult task longer. That is, it affects their persistence, and more likely to attribute success to the self and failure to an unstable source. So, I had this, but all the cards were stacked against me, and I gave it my best, and it still didn't pan out, right? That's how I handle failure. And if I succeed, I say, look, I knew I could do it, and I busted my ass, and I got it done. Right? So the high DC benefit, well, higher goals are achieved because we select more challenging goals over time, right? Responses to challenge, well, we have a higher completion rate when we have a higher desire for control. Now, persistence, difficult tasks are completed. That is, we're more likely to persist. And finally, motivation level throughout the task, in spite of obstacles and challenges, tends to remain higher. Now, what about this high desire for control? Is it all positives, or does it come with liabilities? And we can see that there are some liabilities. We may attempt goals that are too difficult. Right? We may develop performance inhibiting reactions. We may invest too much effort when it really wasn't warranted, that we should have punted at some point in time. And we may develop an illusion of control that doesn't necessarily exist. All right, I think it is about time for changing gears. We're going to move away from, and you can see a lot of this is kind of trait level stuff, and that's where we began at the beginning of the lecture. Now we're going to move into this interesting area of mindsets. So we're going to explore some mindsets. And mindsets are a way of viewing the world, right? So mindsets can serve as motivators or feed into, at least inhibit or expand our motivational level. Now, mindsets can be chronic, they can be trait. So let's say that someone is a racist. I know that term is popular now. Let me give you a very simple definition of racism. I'm engaging racism when I use race to explain an observed phenomenon. So I'm motivated to say, hey, this is the way the world is, and then I give you an explanation that centers around race as the variable that causes the observed differences or whatever, right? So that would be explaining the world on the basis of race is I'm engaging in racism. Now, if I do this chronically, if this is my trait, if this is my go-to, right, and we know people like this who use race as an explanation across the board. Oh, it's because of race, it's because of race, or it could be because of gender, it could be, you know, because of religion. It's all kind of grouped under the same umbrella, right? So it can be chronic, and that's when we call it a trait level kind of racism. And the person earns the title racist. Now, occasionally we might use race to explain an observed phenomenon, but it's not our go-to. It's not something we do consistently. It might be on the basis of an activated state, that something we become aware of something, right? And then we engage in it temporarily. That's state activated. Now, it could be interactive. That is, chronic trait sensitizes the individual to situational state variables. So people who carry racism around, people who are genuine racists, then look for features in the environment to support their go-to, so to speak. Now, mindsets originated as explanations for implicit motivation or goal-directed processing. And what does that mean? That means that when we talk about racism for which people are not aware, let's call it implicit bias, right? And we talk about implicit bias training. That is, it's my go-to and I'm not even aware I'm doing it because it's become habitual. So then what we do is we see that people maybe apply a harsher standard to one group than another group. Right? And think about that sheriff in Georgia. You know, the sheriff, after we have someone who allegedly goes and shoots up a bunch of, kills 8 people, right, in massage parlors. It kills 8 people. And then the sheriff wants to explain his behavior. What motivated the suspect to do this? And that's a fair question to ask someone who's arrested a suspect in a severe crime. What motivated them to do this? And he says, well, he was having a bad day. And for most of us, that motivation is going to fall a little short. It's like, I have bad days all the time. And I've never, even once, thought that my having a bad day would justify me going and killing 8 people. Notice that it's not a very good explanation for the motivated behavior of murdering people, right? He had a bad day. Well, what's going on here? Well, isn't it interesting that the sheriff sought to explain that behavior, really demonstrated his implicit bias? We have a white suspect, we have a white sheriff, right? And the guy goes, kills a bunch of Asians. What do we say? He's having a bad day. Now, let's suppose that the ethnicity of the shooter had been different. Would that sheriff have come up with the explanation of he was having a bad day? Or would it be something else? Right? And I'll leave that for you to decide. But notice how these mindsets or implicit bias motivate people to process information differently. That is, we're going to respond more favorably to this person because of their category membership, and we're going to respond less favorably to someone because of their category membership. So we see how these mindsets affect the motivation in terms of understanding the world, motivation in seeking out evidence, further evidence, or going with the very simple explanation. So That being said, when we look at the 1950s through the 1980s, in social psychology especially, this concept of mindsets and the motivating properties of mindsets was largely kicked to the curb. And guys like Harold Kelly, true cognitive social psychologists, are like, no, there are no mindsets, right? Basically, all human beings operate with the same goal, and that is to be accurate in their conclusions. Right? People want to be accurate. It's kind of hardwired. It's built in. Now I'm speaking like a cognitive social psychologist, right? And if we want to describe how people are behaving, they're behaving a lot like scientists. Now they're not trained scientists, so we'll call them intuitive scientists. But that is, we view people as active information processors who want to come to the correct conclusion. So they'll take in as much information as they can until they're assured that they're going to come to the correct conclusion, because they're functioning like intuitive scientists. That is, they have at their heart, that is, the brain itself has this mechanism that wants to be accurate, right? And these guys really said human motivation doesn't exist. I know. It's like, human motivation doesn't exist. What you have is a brain, and the brain is hardwired to process information, and built into that is the need for accuracy. So humans process information to the best of their capability to come to an accurate conclusion. Right? And for example, cost-benefit analysis. So we see then it rolls into this kind of financial context that people want to minimize their losses and maximize their gains. And that is a basic human hardwired phenomenon, right? And notice how hard it is to have this conversation with not using the word motivation. But these guys denied the existence of motivation, right? It's a cognitive process that are best understood, driven by the goals of being accurate. So they'll use the goal, accuracy goal, but never accuracy motivation, because they're speaking against the concept of motivation in its entirety. And from about the 1950s to the 1980s, they were kind of legit in doing this, because there had never been a laboratory experiment that demonstrated motivation. So motivation, you know, back in Freudian times, yeah, drives, motivation. We talked about the history of motivation. People are all down with motivation. But from this period about 1950 to 1980, 1990, motivation was taken off the table by cognitive psychologists. So Kelly's covariation theory, for example, says, look, we ultimately want to understand why people do what they do. So we'll watch people, but it follows a very simple formula. If I want to understand this stranger and why they are doing what they're doing, it's a three-part formula. There's three questions that need to be answered. Upon answering these questions, I will come to the correct solution. Because remember, the correct solution is what we all are headed towards, according to guys like Kelly. So the stranger raves about the film. And the first thing I say is, okay, the stranger's raving about the film. How do people in general feel about the film? And if other people don't rave about the film, and I say, well, why is the stranger raving about the film? Because no one else does. Well, there's something about this person that likes this film, so I end up with this personal dispositional attribution. Why does a stranger rave about the film? Because there's something inherent about the person's character, the stranger's character, that causes them to do that. Right? Now, note though, as I move through this process, let's suppose it's a little different. The stranger raves about the film, and I say, well, what's the consensus? How do other people feel about the film? And in this case, rather than low, hey, everyone loves the film. Well, then, what's the best guess on why the stranger is raving about the film? Because it's a good film. And that's a situational attribution. The film is the cause of the observed behavior, not something about the person's character. Now, the distinctiveness, question number 2 that is automatically asked by this cognitive mechanism Kelly's described. Distinctiveness. Low, stranger raves about many other films. Well, and you say, okay, so the stranger raves about this film, but he also raves about many other films. It doesn't really tell us anything about the film. It tells us that the stranger is maybe a movie buff. The stranger has a wide variety of tastes. They like movies in general. So again, notice I'm talking about the stranger rather than the film as a cause of their raving. But let's suppose the distinctiveness is high. The stranger doesn't rave about many other films. In fact, the stranger hates most other films, but loves this film. Well, now notice we're talking about the film rather than the stranger. We're making an attribution for the stranger's behavior on the basis of the situation. That is the specific film. Now, consistency, I've never really gotten a good grip on. It doesn't tell us a lot in this particular example. Hi, the stranger always raves about this film, so that is if the stranger sees the film and then goes to see it again, they continue to rave about the film. Same here, the stranger always raves about this film, they continue. Well, is it about the film? I don't know. Is it about him? I don't know. So here we're left not understanding necessarily the reason for the stranger raving about the film. We better revert to the first two questions to get a handle on that. Okay. So here's this basic human need, according to Fritz Heider. We need to understand why people do what they do. We need to understand why the stranger raves about the film. We need to understand why our partner is feeling bad today. We always want to understand the reason for the observed behavior, according to Kelly, and we're going to do a very mechanical, very linear analysis and come to our conclusion. None of this has anything to do with motivation. Well, according to the school, motivation didn't exist. Humans simply process, and the process mechanism is accuracy driven. So the process is understanding the cause of behavior and assigning an observed behavior to a cause, right? And we want to do so as accurately as possible. But Kelly and many people said, you know what? But people mess this up all the time. And they mess it up. So if they mess it up, then we must call it a mistake or an error. Because we know the process, we know how the process works, and if the process isn't being properly employed, then we'll call it an error. It's an error in judgment that really is caused by processing errors. So, what are some of those processing errors? And these become huge in the psychological literature. False consensus effect. That is, I tend to believe that more people agree with me than actually do. And this is just an error. This is just the way the mechanism works. We have a tendency to do this. The fundamental attribution error. I tend to, when I observe a behavior, give an explanation that has to do with the characteristics or the disposition of the actor who committed the behavior. I tend to ignore why they might have done it because the situation required it. Yeah. And I know these are repetitive for you. Or the actor-observer effect. When someone does something really well, and it's them, then I say, wow, look how lucky they were, right? That is, the situation allowed them to do that. Whereas when I do it, it's like, oh my God, look, I did that and I did it well. That's because I'm bitching. And I'm using a character-based explanation. But notice, when something bad happens, I say, oh my God, I was so unlucky. But when something bad happens to them, I say, ooh, bad person, right? So I flip it around. Well, errors should be universal under this situation because we have one processing mechanism that operates the same for all of us. So when we see errors, boom, that's it. They're just errors. So it should be universal. The degree of error may reflect individual differences, but the errors are universal. So let's go to homework 8. Next part. Potential gains to the self from processing errors. And I think this is what's important, right? Consider the cognitive perspective. They say we're intuitive scientists. Accuracy is the goal. We therefore are programmed to achieve accurate conclusions. Now, when we're inaccurate, it represents a processing error, such as fundamental attribution error, defensive attribution error, actor-observer effect, false consensus effect, just to name 4. There's a long list of these errors. Like another one better? Hey, go ahead and use it for this question if you so choose. Whoever is going to answer this question, one person answers. Create a brief scenario demonstrating one of the processing errors, then describe the benefit of the person's to the person's self for the person making the error. So let's suppose, and don't use this example because I'm going to use it. I'm driving down the highway. I'm in the fast lane, the number 1 lane. I'm driving down the highway. I'm doing 67 and a 65 because I think that's legit, right? And I'm a good driver, and I'm awesome and bitching and all that good stuff. And now all of a sudden, this person just screams up behind me, and all of a sudden they're on my bumper, and it's like, oh my God, they're on my bumper. They're going to hit my car, right? And they look like they're, you know, wigging out back there and wigging out. And I'm like, I know I should tap on my brake and scare the shit out of them because they shouldn't be going that fast in this lane. They shouldn't be tailgating me because that's wrong, and I'm a good driver, and they're obviously a shitty driver. You shitty driver, where'd you get your driver's license? In a box of Cracker Jacks, right? And then I say, oh, but wait a second, Mark. You are not like the highway enforcer. Why don't you just move over and let the maniac pass? And I say, okay, I will move over. The maniac passes me. They speed by me. They stomp it. But then I notice that in the back seat of the car is a woman holding a bleeding baby. And I go, oh, maybe he wasn't driving like an idiot because he's an idiot. Maybe he's driving too fast because he was trying to rush that baby to a hospital. Notice the situation was causing his behavior, not the fact that he's an idiot driver. The disposition was not the best explanation. Okay? So there's a scenario. Now let's back off. What gain do I get by making the first assumption that this person is a horrible driver? Well, they're a horrible driver, and I know that because I'm a great driver. And because I'm a great driver, I'm entitled to drive their, I'm entitled to judge their driving as not as good as mine. So notice, by making that dispositional attribution, oh, what an idiot, I'm actually elevating myself. I'm making myself look better. So now let me ask you at this point, was it simply an error that we tend to prefer disposition over situation as an explanation? Or is there actually a gain? That is, I gain self-esteem by thinking that I'm better than someone else, by going through that whole routine of blaming their character. This is where it gets interesting, because describe the benefit to the person's self, and it's almost always these are benefits to the self, right? Okay, so let us then discuss this idea of motivated reasoning. Ziva Kunda developed this idea around 1990, and she says, look, motivation exists, you guys. And we see the results of our reasoning process often are driven by our motivation. That is, we're going into this reasoning process, we already have the conclusion in mind. This is the conclusion I want. So now let's just work backwards. If I want this conclusion, what information do I need to achieve that conclusion? And now, motivated processing of the information. This information does not support my conclusion, so I'm going to deny that information. This information does support my conclusion, so I'm going to support that information. That is, I pick and choose information as it allows me to come to my preferred conclusion. So you can see where this is a profoundly significant idea that Kunda has presented us in the 1990s, and she actually challenged us. She says, you know, there's a bunch of studies out there that kind of demonstrate motivation exists, but motivation wasn't part of the hypotheses. And if we go back and we look at those studies and we rewrite those studies with motivation as part of the hypotheses, maybe we can actually present motivation as a legitimate concept and provide laboratory evidence of how motivation works. Well, first, that it exists at all, and then how it works, how it exists. And that's what got many of us our start in social psychology. My advisor at UCI, Pete Ditto, was one of the first to design an experiment that demonstrated that motivation exists in the laboratory, answering Ziva Kunda's call. Unfortunately, we lost Ziva Kunda to brain cancer in her early 40s. It was tragic because she had such a huge career ahead of her and just such an amazing person. But her definition is any wish, desire, or preference that concerns the outcome of a given reasoning task, so that's where I want to end up, Anytime I manipulate my perception of the information to support the conclusion or to refute the conclusion, I'm engaging in motivated reasoning. And she says she doesn't attempt to address the thorny issue of how motives are represented, and that's really, she was working with neuroscientists back in the 80s and 90s to get to that. So that's the question. How is motivation represented in the brain becomes, we're passing the ball to the neuroscience people at that point. So there's two categories of motivated reasoning. What we end up with then is sometimes we do want to arrive at an accurate conclusion. We just want to do it right. I want to put a roof on the house. I want to put the best roof on the house for the lowest money possible. And I'm going to take bids, and I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to look at the pros and cons, and hopefully my reasoning is accurate as a result of this. You want to select a college? You've been accepted to 4 colleges. Which college do you select? Well, hopefully you're going to want to arrive at an accurate conclusion, right? But sometimes we don't want to arrive at an accurate conclusion. Accuracy isn't even part of the criteria. We want to arrive at a particular directional conclusion. So the limit to this is we're not capable, we're not at liberty to believe just anything. And of course, we see this, with COVID. COVID became, instead of a scientific endeavor for many people, COVID became a political endeavor. So I think about all the people in this university who are busting their asses to understand what COVID is, what to do about COVID, from the medical center, all these amazing researchers on the immune system that exist. These people want to come to an accurate conclusion. They want to say, hey, this is what it is, this is how it operates, right? But think about it. In the state of Ohio, there's a whole faction of people who don't approach it scientifically. They don't want to come to an accurate conclusion. They want to come to a political conclusion. That is, their party says, this is the nature of COVID and this is what it means. And now that I have that preferred conclusion, I already have a defined endpoint. Now I'm going to take information that is consistent and I'm going to say, hey, this is great information. It supports my point of view. But the information that doesn't support my point of view, I reject. And I say, that's bad information. It's a bad test. It's my nephew. I wanted to think that vaccine is an evil, horrible thing. And I'm talking to him, and he says, well, this is an experimental vaccine. And I'm like, uh-huh. And that's true. And that doesn't mean it's a bad vaccine. It just means it's experimental. And we're accelerating the vaccination process because of the threat that we think the disease, possesses. We got 550,000 people dead in this country from this virus. I think we need to do something. COVID last year was the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. And other people say, well, this is no worse than the flu. It's like, well, no, actually, it's much more severe than the flu. So for the people who are saying it's not as severe, it's no more severe than the flu, where are they trying to go with their ultimate reasoning? And the people who say, no, this is much worse than the flu, where are they trying to go? Notice they have different preferred conclusions, so they process the information differently. Motivated reasoning is fascinating, and it explains so much in what we observe. So, here is the lineage. And this is how it kind of works when we look at researchers and kind of their pedigree. What was their upbringing and where did they come from? Kunda and her ideas on motivated reasoning inspire Pete Ditto at UCI. I'm an undergraduate student. I go into Ditto's lab to do some research so I can get qualifications, right? I can make myself appealing to a graduate school. And then, as I'm finishing up, at UCI, I've applied to graduate school, and one of the places I applied was Ohio State. And who did I want to work with at Ohio State in the social psychology department? I wanted to work with Phil Tetlock. Why did I want to work with Phil Tetlock? Because he was interested in studying how motivation affects decision making. so I had been groomed for this position with Phil. And basically what Phil was working on and what I contributed to in our lab was 1/3 of what he was working on is this deviant functionalist metaphor. And I know that sounds really kind of highbrow and super sketchy. But remember that Kelly in the cognitive said people act like intuitive scientists. And Tetlock says, yeah, sometimes people do act like intuitive scientists that ultimately they want to come to an accurate conclusion. But he says, like Kunda said, sometimes people don't necessarily want to be accurate. They want to come to a preferred conclusion. And when they want to come to a preferred conclusion, it's not that they're making reasoning errors, that they're employing strategies to allow them to come to that conclusion. So this is critical, because what Tetlock is saying is those things that, like the fundamental attribution error, the cognitive scientists are calling an error. He said, we could step back from that and not call it an error. We could call it a strategy from this new perspective. And he says then there's 3 strategies, mindsets, that are demonstrated within these mindsets that are not about accuracy, but coming to a preferred conclusion. And one is the intuitive prosecutor. I'm going to take each one of these in turn. Another is the intuitive theologian. And finally, the intuitive politician. And we often kid Phil, he said, well, what about the intuitive blah? What about the intuitive this? What about the intuitive that? And he could almost always explain those in terms of these 3. And he says, we don't need 20-something intuitive blanks. Let's keep it simple. Let's try and see if we can cover it with 3. And it really is about the context. This is, and one of the assignments was a Peabody plot. Some of you maybe chose to write about the Peabody plot, and you can see where this comes in. That someone who is rigid versus flexible, right? Well, it depends on the context and how we ultimately want to describe that. So here we have the realization that sometimes right is wrong. That sometimes rigid means standing your ground. If I want to look at rigidity favorably, I'll say this is someone who's got some backbone and wants to stand their ground. If I want to look at rigidity unfavorably, then I use terms like rigid, inflexible, right? Obtuse. Notice, where do I want to go with my definition about rigidity? Do I want to talk about it as a benefit, or do I want to talk about it as something undesirable? And I will provide examples that support either argument. Depending on where I want to go with it, that is my motivation. So sometimes, what one group might consider right, another group might consider wrong. And so then we are left with one of my favorite words. Favorite word, I don't know if we said it enough in this context because we're not in live classes, depends. In, out, it depends. So right, wrong, or the contextualist perspective says, well, it could be right, it could be wrong, it depends on the context. Right? This leads researchers then, and this is one of the things I loved about working in Tetlock's lab, is search for situations where previous observations no longer found or even reversed. So we looked at developing in our experimental context where someone might want to punish someone more, or find the variable that we could manipulate so someone might want to punish that person less, right? What is that kind of tipping point that goes from one context to the other? Let's talk about the intuitive prosecutor mindset then. This is the area in which I worked with Dr. Tetlock. The motivation is to restore, maintain system or social order, and or to punish wrongdoers. So sometimes, and see if this resonates with you. Sometimes, justice is a cool concept, and everyone should be treated fairly, and everyone should be treated justly, and we should maintain our allegiance to due process. But could you imagine a situation where things appear to be going so out of control that maybe for a little while we just need to be clamped down and not worry so much about due process at the moment, and just clamp down and get things back in order, and then we're free to be more flexible and engage in more due process type behavior? Sometimes extreme times demand extreme responses. Like, for example, After 9/11, we decided, well, you know, before 9/11, privacy was kind of really important in this country. We got to have privacy. Post 9/11 and the Patriot Act, what we say now is all electronic communications is being stored and all electronic communications can be looked at. So prior to 9/11, your cell phone was essentially private or supposed to be private. Post 9/11, we're now justified in using secret courts, developing secret warrants to get at your cell phone information. And we have the ability to record every conversation you have ever made or will ever make on your cell phone. And perhaps take a look at it if one of these secret courts think it's necessary. Now, I know that you guys could create an argument that says, well, yeah, okay, I see where we need to do that. Or, oh my God, no, we shouldn't do that. Context, then, the greater the threat level, the more it pushes you to accepting the argument that it's okay. When the threat level is diminished, then the argument doesn't sound okay. So, the intuitive prosecutor mindset, then, it's a motivated attributional style. Motivated style of explaining behavior that processes information in a way that favor drawing certain conclusions over others, and it's usually in the support of being more harsh towards a defendant, for example. So specifically, right, selectively weighting information to justify increased accountability and increased punitiveness, that is punishment, for those that represent threats to the social order. So the more threatening this person is that I perceive them towards social order, the more I'm justified in coming down on them harder. The more I can play fast and loose with due process and rights, right? The less willing I am to listen to alibis or excuses. I don't really care. What really matters is what happened. And how that happened is not a consideration. That it did happen is all important and we're going to respond to it. Right? And there's a lot of research that looks at this, like, for example, this idea of excuses. Hey, don't hold me accountable because I have this excuse. Well, when the shit hits the fan, excuses start to be ignored. Hey, everyone's got an excuse, I don't want to hear it, right? And you know that this could also be an individual difference. You have a wide variation of teachers who will accept your excuse and give you the benefit of the doubt and allow you to turn in an assignment late or not, right? So, can depend on who offers the excuse. So, Tetlock et al. 2007, Visser and Tetlock 1999, that one was unpublished. Found that people who are embedded in society, strongly embedded, people who are, let's say, law enforcement representatives, their excuses will be listened to a greater extent than civilian excuses. Right? Can depend on how serious the offense, and we did a lot of research in this area. The more serious the offense, the more people injured, the more we have to do something about it. And the more we have to do something about it, the less willing we are to entertain due process and excuses, etc. And then can depend on the threat the act poses. So the perceived threat from, we look at the Philippines now. And what do we see? We see, that drug abuse is a problem. It's threatening the fabric of society. So what can we do? Well, we can suspend rights, so we can just go search people's houses without warrants. We can incarcerate people for greater lengths of time. We're justified in doing this because the use of drugs is so threatening to Filipino society, right? So the more threatening we believe an act is, then it allows us to, so when we see the Black Lives Matter protests, oh my God, these are threatening the fabric of our society. These are creating tremendous threats to the safety of people, which was not realized, wasn't part of the deal. But it justifies us in coming down stronger. So in fact, what do? We have unarmed protesters who are being met with rubber bullets, tear gas, etc. But then at the same time, we have other people protesting who are carrying guns, etc. And the police are just like, oh, okay, whatever. Note that one group is thought to, possess a much greater threat than the other group. And then that justifies the differential response to those two groups. And if we're going to argue this point, what's going to happen, and this is the motivated reasoning part, if I'm on the side of, white people and law and order, then come down on those Black Lives Matter folks, and don't worry about the people marching on the Capitol, the white people marching on the Capitol with guns, right? Because I'm going to apply different standards to those groups based on my ultimate desired conclusion and position. So that's how motivated reasoning works. Now, we see then the intuitive prosecutor, to summarize, specifically weighing information to become more harsh towards people that we feel are threatening our way of life or society. Now, another motivated mindset processing style, the intuitive theologian. Motivation is to uphold the moral order and or not consider taboo trade-offs. Now, taboo trade-off, and this is a fancy term, Phil loves to make up these fancy terms, is an option that cannot even be considered because it violates a significant value or moral. So let's suppose we have an infant come to Ohio State Hospital, and it is obvious that this infant has no insurance, its parents have no insurance, and the nature of its problem can be estimated to cost $40 million to repair. So as a business, let's say that my role in the hospital is to budget and determine how money should be spent. And so people come to me and say, look, we gotta help this child. This poor baby's going to die without our intervention. And I say, okay, so what is the treatment regime? What are we looking at? And we're looking at, well, it's probably going to take us a couple years and run $40 to $50 million, which the hospital is going to have to bear the burden of that cost. And I'm like, wow, $40, $50 million can go a long way. And what you're asking me to do is approve this expense, the spending of $40, $50 million on this one infant with no guarantee of success. I don't know that I can do that. I don't think that we should go there. And someone else is going to say, this is a life of a child, the life of the infant is not negotiable. Notice that trying to put a price on the saving of this infant to some people would be a taboo trade-off. It's just not even something that's allowed to be considered. You cannot put a financial value on a child's life. You have to do whatever is necessary. It's like, and that would then be someone who's operating at that moment in time like an intuitive theologian. That is, there is a moral prescription. That is, this is the way I believe the world works, and we must adhere to it. So, questions about that? You can see where the right to choose an abortion, right, for some folks becomes a taboo trade-off. They say, no, every child's life is sacred, so abortion is just not possible. This is not, we can't even converse about this. We're not even allowed to talk about this. There's nothing that can be said that would ever change my mind, right? It becomes a taboo trade-off. And this is where then people have a hard time sitting down at the table, because when they act like an intuitive theologian, they've entered into a realm of cognitive inflexibility. I can't even hear your argument. I can't even countenance that idea. And then finally, the intuitive politician. And we've had some great examples over the last 4 years. The motivation is to make a good impression and or please one's audience. You know, and now it isn't about me saying anything that's true or accurate. It's just about me, my ultimate motivation. Remember, for the intuitive scientist, the ultimate motivation, or goal, I should say, is accuracy. When I'm acting like an intuitive politician, the ultimate goal is to please that audience. So I'll say whatever the hell I need, because my goal is to please that audience. For example, I once attended a question and answer. This was at Columbus State, where the dean explained 2 different types of permanence in answer to a question. And they said, well, you know, there's permanent permanence, but there's also temporary permanence. And a lot of us at that point are going like, what? The temporary is not permanent, and there is no temporary permanence, right? But note also that when the previous administration got caught in verifiable lies, they said, well, no, we weren't wrong, we weren't lying, there's just an alternative fact. And it's like, so now we're entering to a realm where these alternative facts exist, and we can just make up facts to support our ultimate position. Not so much, right? So Homework 8, consider the functionalist perspective, intuitive prosecutor, intuitive theologian, or intuitive politician. Give an example of when you behave, process info in a way consistent with one of the three functionalist mindsets. Which functionalist metaphor are you talking about? What was the situation? So let's explain that. What led to the functionalist mindset? Was it situationally instigated, or is it chronic mindset for you? And I found in the laboratory when I was researching, sometimes we could cause people to be more punitive based on the nature of the crime or the offense that they were reading about. Other people were hang 'em high folks. They were punitive the moment they walked into the lab, and our manipulation didn't matter. They were going to be punitive no matter what. And then finally, how might this be adaptive or protective? And note, this can be adaptive because if we believe the society is spinning out of control, it might be adaptive for us to clamp down for a little while. Or not. I'll leave that to you to describe, right? Or to discuss. So again, mindsets can be chronic. They reflect a motivational style seen across a wide range of situations. So we know there are people in politics who are chronic intuitive politicians. Their whole world is say whatever you need to say to get done whatever you need to get done. Right? So they will say anything to an audience that they think they can get away with, right, and advances their agenda. Or it can be temporary and can be activated in the laboratory. And thank God for that, because what we were able to do then was to demonstrate this in the laboratory repeatedly. And we used many priming techniques, both subliminal and superliminal priming techniques, to push people into these mindsets, and we were able to demonstrate, in fact, that they were in that mindset from the results of the experiment. So, these are often motivated, these ways to manipulate people, by the government press to cause emotional response to a given group. So what do? Well, I can amplify the nature of threat. I can say, look at this. There are caravans coming up from Central America to take us over. Caravans of rapers and drug users and murderers. And these caravans coming up to the United States are going to cross this open border, and they're going to threaten the very existence of the United States. If we allow these caravans to come up here, the United States will cease to exist as we know it and love it. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a perception of increased threat to cause people to adopt a more punitive mindset. And one thing then that people were able to do says, well, I know what we should do then. What we're going to do is when these people reach the border, we're going to take their children away from them. And that'll show them. Because I can't think of anything more punishing to do to a parent than to take their children away from them. And yet many people believe that that was justified. Now, if I'm going to be an intuitive theologian, right, that's an intuitive prosecutor. Hey, it's justified to take these children away from their parents because that'll teach them a lesson. But an intuitive theologian would say, the bond between a parent and a child is sacred and must never be broken. There is nothing that will ever justify, in this context, taking a child away from its parent. Can't do it. Won't do it. Don't allow it. So now you can see the intuitive prosecutor on one side saying, take those children away. You can see the intuitive theologian saying, that's a crime against humanity. You must not ever do that under any circumstances. Okay, I hope those examples help you out. So, we can manipulate perceptions. We can cause reasoning to be distorted or at least affected. Activates action tendencies, approach or avoidance. And it also serves to justify our responses. So that's about it on motivated mindsets. The idea is, though, that mindsets, and let's get to the bottom line here, mindsets can be temporarily activated or they can be chronic. And when they're chronic, we can describe them as personality traits, if you will, or personality characteristics. And they can motivate one's perception of a situation. They can motivate one's behavior towards a group. They can motivate one to adopt certain goals or preferences over another. Okay? And that's it. So I hope you have a good day, and let's say goodbye to Boots and one of Boots' babies. So Yeah, Boots doesn't come up during the lectures here. Boots is down, sleeping on the couch in the living room. Boots is waiting for me to come down there at the end of the day, stretch my feet out onto the coffee table, and then Boots puts herself right on my thighs, right? And that's where she loves to lay. She did it when she was pregnant with all her babies, and she's done it ever since. 10 years now, Boots laying on my legs. And she just looks at me. Are you going to sit down anytime soon? You going to stretch out your legs so I can crash? There you go, Boots. That's her motivation in life. I hope you guys have a great day.